Hey everyone, welcome to another week of Political Capital. I'm your host Rob Shaw from the Check News Studios in Victoria, bringing you all the latest on BC politics. I want to start the show off a little differently this week. Obviously, the horrific news of the discovery of 215 children in an unmarked mass grave at Kamloops Residential School has been the topic politically across British Columbia, across Canada. And in watching the debate from politicians this week in the legislature, there was an incredibly moving speech by Green MLA Adam Olsen, the MLA for Saanich North and the Islands and member of the Startlip Nation. I wanted to start the show by playing some of that speech for you. I think it was very moving, very powerful, one of the most powerful speeches I've seen in the legislature. So we're going to start the show with that. Here is Green MLA Adam Olsen.
Today I stand in this House to honor those who lost their lives in the residential school system. The words that I'm going to speak today aren't easy, and they are direct. Like many of my peers, my grandparents, my great aunties and uncles are survivors of Cooper Island Residential School. I know that they'd want me here today, honoring the horrors that they lived through by demanding accountability for them. The resounding story that I heard from Indigenous leaders this weekend is that this is the beginning. We know in our hearts this is the beginning. For the last several years, our Crown governments and society believes that it has been doing the work of reconciliation. After all, many of these stories have already been shared by residential school survivors through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What needs to be addressed here is our response. Specifically, the urgency in our reaction to what has been and what is being uncovered. It's not that we haven't done anything. We've started the work. But have we really moved as quickly as you would expect after hearing these horrors? We know that if these children were not Indigenous, but rather European, that we would not have been slow to act. I see on social media my friends and colleagues sharing graphics agreeing that all children matter, yet deep down we know that in our society it's just a fact. In Canada and British Columbia, some children matter less. We know underneath the shiny, happy facade of Canada and British Columbia, there lurks a grotesque and shameful past. For 30 years, my relatives have been sharing their experiences from these despicable institutions. For 30 years, those stories have been hushed. Our relatives have been told that Canadians and British Columbians don't want to hear their stories. They've been told to stop lying. They've been told to stop embellishing. There was a statement from this institution that noted the unimaginable proportions of this tragedy. And this is an incredibly unfortunate characterization of the situation that we carry. For Indigenous people, this story is not shocking, nor is it unimaginable. This is the trauma our families have carried for generations. When people ask me what our problem is, why don't we pick ourselves up? They haven't wanted to hear the answer. As we continue to grapple with missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, hanging red dresses in recognition of our current reality, what is uncovered in Kamloops is the stark reminder that this storyline is not new. It has been in the imagination, indeed in the nightmares of our relatives for the past 130 years. It is the terror that our ancestors have lived with. The only reason to call it unimaginable would be because these institutions, these Crown governments, federal and provincial governments, people that populate these chambers in the past either haven't been listening to our stories or they've cared less, because it is a reality in our country that some children have mattered less. These are both terrible considerations. There is nothing to imagine for those who have been paying attention. Our elders, our families have been sharing the grim details of their experiences in residential schools for decades. That is the record of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You don't have to imagine it. You just have to believe it and care enough to act with the urgency that you would if it was your child that didn't return home from school.
That was Adam Olsen in the legislature this week as a response to a ministerial statement. Premier John Horgan and also members of the Liberals spoke about this issue. I think he encapsulated some of the thoughts very well. And I urge you, there's another 5 minutes of the speech if you'd like to listen to that on the legislature website. We're going to move on now to some other topics from this week. I'm bringing the panel. As usual, Katie actually is off this week again. So we have Maclean Kay from the Orca. Hello, Maclean.
Hey, Rob.
And Jillian Oliver, from a BC Green strategist. Hello, Jillian.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Thank you both for being here. We're going to move on to the issue of forestry, which was much anticipated this week. The intentions paper from Premier John Horgan that kind of brings a new lens to the previous weeks where you and I have talked about old growth forests, the protests on old growth forests, the debate between logging and environmental protection. The Premier said this plan was going to chart the future of this issue. It did not, in my mind, really do that, but I'm interested in what each of you think of this plan and what we can take away from it or what it does and doesn't do. Jillian, what do you think of this?
Well, I think that, the plan is good in what it does address, which is the issue of there being only a few big multinational corporations that have the forest tenures in BC. What this plan does is gives the government more power to redistribute that a little bit between First Nations and smaller communities. So the idea is that these kind of smaller producers, Indigenous owned producers, will keep more value of the fiber in their communities, which is a good thing. It's overdue. Should have been done a long time ago, and it's really positive, but it doesn't do anything on old growth. So it was a bit perplexing why the government chose to release this now. It's something they've been talking about for a long time. It looks like something they've been working on for a long time. I think that they were trying to release it as cover to show that they've been working on it, but I think it kind of backfired because they didn't announce anything to do with the actual issue at hand, which is the deferrals that activists are asking for in old growth forests.
Yeah, the Premier framed it as a response to old growth during questions in question period, and yet you're right, it doesn't have anything. There's no extra deferrals. There's no protection for Fairy Creek, which is the kind of the flashpoint of this protest, the issue of old growth and logging right now. And it focused on, Jillian, as you mentioned, it focused on the idea of tenures, with 5 big forest companies controlling more than half the tenures. The Premier has long kind of taken shots at those forest companies for investing overseas, for not having the social licenses, he put it, to take our public trees and export raw logs. And so he completed that shot by saying they're going to take some tenures away from them and redistribute them to Aboriginal and local communities. But that was the substance of the plan, and yet it was billed as an old growth response. Maclean, did it catch you by surprise at all?
No, only in that, they had been signaling for some time that there was going to be some change coming. The surprise was, as you put it very well, is that it was framed and presented as a response to the protest situation at Fairy Creek. But if you spend any time around the provincial government, that ministry, that file, is the single biggest thing government does. Yes, the Ministry of Health spends more money, and rightfully so, but the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations, I don't know what percentage of the province is Crown land, and everything from mining to forestry. So it's a massive file, and forestry takes up the biggest part of it. And there's a lot of moving pieces there, from the still recovering from the pine beetle epidemic to the tenures that you mentioned. And so there was an attempt in this plan to kind of cover the bases and make some overdue corrections on a number of fronts. But yes, given what has been happening at Fairy Creek, it was presented as here's our response to this crisis, and it really wasn't that at all.
Yeah, so the question is now what then, I guess, for the old growth protest? I think there's more than 160 people now in the Premier's riding, Fairy Creek near Port Renfrew, that have been arrested. Is there going to be any response from government on this? Jillian, we'll go back to you, because the Premier, he took the Fairy Creek question and he went the route of reconciliation, where he said, I am not going to overrule the local Aboriginal community, the Pachidat First Nation, whose elected chief and hereditary chief are in support of the old growth logging, even though there are some elders who aren't. I'm not going to overrule that as premier because that would be colonialism. So he seems to be indicating the government's not going to do anything about the Fairy Creek issue. What do you make of that strategy, and is that a sustainable position for the premier to take?
Well, I think no, because Fairy Creek is just the latest flashpoint in the old growth movement, the movement to protect old growth. Just today, I saw a news article that the Gitxsan, some members of the Gitxsan Nation are blockading part of their old growth forest. The province is asking them to take down the blockade. So there's every place that there's old growth is going to be on a different territory that has a different dynamic, and there are First Nations that have asked the government for deferrals that they haven't given. So it's only going to get more complicated if they're really focusing this if they're really focusing on that issue, on the reconciliation issue. The Minister Conroy did say that more deferrals are coming this summer. If that is in some of the hot spots that is really that high productivity old growth, those really big trees that people want to see protected, it might take a little bit of turn down the temperature a little bit, but we'll just have to see what those are when they come out.
What do you think of the political strategy there, Maclean? Just the premier just kind of not willing to do anything in Fairy Creek because of the permissions that he sees from locals to allow that logging.
Well, I mean, he's in almost an impossibly difficult spot because everything that Jillian just said is true. But the complication in the Pachidat is that this First Nation has asked for much of this to happen, and it has in fact told protesters and the CRD to back off. It's notable that when the hearing for the injunction to remove the protesters happened, the Pachidat elder, I believe his name is Bill Jones, specifically told the judge he does not speak for the First Nation. He in no way is a representative who can speak for the people. And yet he has been held up as, well, we're here by invitation. And yet those who you would think would be recognized as being able to speak for the people who are obviously probably divided, as most of us are on any issue, they have said go away. And so what is the premier to do? He might agree in his heart of hearts with the points that Jillian has just raised, and I suspect he does, about wanting to protect old growth forests, all things being equal. But in this particular case, which is happening, a year after the Wet'suwet'en protests and 2 years after UNDRIP, it puts him in a difficult position.
Mm-hmm. It's a very difficult position, and it's also, the government pointed to partnerships between Aboriginal leaders and forest companies as the future of BC's forest sector, and the idea of the Hawaiiat Western Forest Products Partnership near Bamfield was mentioned as an example of that. And here in Fairy Creek, you could argue there's almost a kind of partnership in a way between the local First Nations and the logging of some of these trees, and the government can't seem to get around that, supporting that, but also supporting protecting old growth, and it's just stuck there. And this did not chart a path out of that problem at all. I think we're going to continue to see questions about it, and we will keep on that. The overdose crisis, but in some ways more the participation of all the politicians in trying to solve it. And we've talked about this in the show previously, but this was a week in which the Green Party sent a letter to the Liberals and to the Premier saying, can't we all just get together and to put the politics out of the overdose crisis and come up with some type of solution? The letter was then mirrored by the Liberals, who said, why can't we do this? And the NDP said, I think the actual quote, if I can find it here, is from the Mental Health Minister, Sheila Malcolmson. If the solutions were in this legislature or in committees, I think we would have solved this already. And that's a reason why the parties don't need to cooperate on the overdose crisis in legislative committees. For people who are listening, legislative committees are kind of these side legislatures where parties put people from all different stripes on it, and they cooperate, and they usually produce a report. They call witnesses, and they get testimony, and they come to some type of agreement usually. So it's a place where you can find a non-political solution. The NDP don't seem interested in this, in the overdose crisis. Maclean, what do you make of all that?
It is one thing for a majority government, to set aside two opposition parties and say, thank you, but no, you will not be glomming any credit for what we hope will be a turnaround on this front. And we all hope there will be. But this government spent most of the last year touting all-party cooperation, saying explicitly over and over again, we have to have this election, this early snap election in a pandemic, because we need to put the politics behind us if we're going to confront the issues in front of us. And the overdose epidemic is, arguably now the biggest issue in front of us. And I mean, the rationale that, well, if committees hadn't solved it, they're not going to solve it now is, I can't think of a worse argument. I mean, it's like saying, well, science hasn't cured cancer, so let's just stop trying. Well, why bother funding more research? It's a terrible argument. Of course, we should be trying to find as many ideas and suggestions and policies to literally save lives on the streets. And the idea that, yes, maybe nothing would come of it, but something might come of it. And in this context, something coming of it would mean people not dying. And so it's hard to imagine a justification for this.
And maybe it would turn the temperature down on what's become a very political issue, overdose and mental health. There's lots of questions in question period. And the problem with it becoming a political issue is that the more the opponents attack, the more the government entrenches and in its position and is unwilling to move for fear of looking weak or that type of thing. Jillian, is there any argument in your mind? Can you see why politicians wouldn't want to cooperate like this? Or how do you sort of interpret the NDP's unwillingness to do something that it did for 3 years in a minority government situation with the Greens, and now doesn't believe that politicians can find a solution together on an issue like this?
Yeah, I think that the reason in this case is, well, maybe potential political credit is one, but I also think that the government is reticent to be having these conversations out in the open. They're difficult conversations around sort of some of the solutions that advocates say we could go farther on, like safe supply and decriminalization, are contentious issues and politically sensitive issues. That's what the Greens are saying. Let us all work together so we can take politics out of the equation, find consensus, and sort of, take this out of the electoral calculus that parties make. But I think it requires the government to relinquish control and to not be having those conversations behind closed doors anymore, to sort of tease out the political issues before they go ahead with some of these more potentially contentious solutions. In a committee, you have open hearings, you have witnesses, everything's on the record and recorded. They can go in camera, I suppose, to sort of discuss things. But but I think that that's the Greens' point, that these conversations, we're at a point, if we're kind of stuck because of politics, where we should be working together to sort of bring the public along, to be talking about why, some of these solutions might sound tough to swallow at first, but it's our responsibility to be having those tough conversations together out in the open. But I think that the government is a bit uneasy about having those because they know that it's tricky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all about control for them. You're right, absolutely.
Yeah.
When you turn over a committee to study an issue, you might end up with recommendations that you don't want to do, and then you've completely lost any high ground as a government from being able to stall those out because you've participated in solutions that you may not be willing to implement. So you're right. I think it's a big part of it. There was a second request actually from the Liberals this week in a letter to the Premier saying, why can't we start up the Select Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs in the wake of the Kamloops residential school tragedy? MLA should be discussing this. Perhaps there could be solutions or paths forward found to what needs to be done in the wake of that discovery. That appears to have gone nowhere either, and that raises another larger issue we've talked about for years. This is my 14th year covering politics, and 14 years I've heard people complain we don't use our legislature well enough to have these committees where people could talk about things. In Ottawa, they do a very good job of that with testimony and witnesses and MPs holding committees. We don't really do that in BC. We don't even have a health committee where 40% of our budget is spent activated to talk about health matters. But on Aboriginal affairs, could that be a turning point to start that committee? And if we could, would it mean anything, do you think, Maclean?
I think it would if it happened. The reasons for it not happening are exactly the same as the last point we just talked about, the other committee. But I think it's particularly important in this case, and not just because of the events of the last week, but the parties in BC are very much divided on regional lines. And so if you are a First Nation in northeastern BC, in the Peace Country, your representation in the legislature is with BC Liberal MLAs. The same could be said for a First Nation in the Cowichan Valley. That you'll have a Green MLA, and so you don't want to be shut out. You don't want your point of access to the legislature is is denied, if there's not going to be a committee. And so just because the First Nations are spread equally and evenly throughout the province, a committee of representatives who would be by definition not just concentrated in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island or anywhere really, is even more important to make sure that those voices are being heard. And this should not be, much like the overdose crisis, this should not be a partisan issue.
Yeah. Jillian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a very like inside baseball thing, but I think it is an important thing to know. It's something I didn't know until I actually worked in politics, how uncollaborative our legislature is, and uniquely uncollaborative. We don't have any time for private members' bills to be debated like they do federally and like they do in other provinces. And half of our committees don't even meet. So yeah, I think Maclean's totally right. This is a really great opportunity to sort of turn that around and to ensure that, voters are getting more value out of their legislators, because right now, there's not a lot for the opposition to do other than to sort of, turn up the dial on politics in the question period.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to a last segment this week where we wanted to instead of doing a typical hot take, we wanted to do a different kind of discussion here, briefly go around the table and go back to the issue of residential schools and just talk to each of us about our personal experience and when did we really learn about that scenario in our lives and our education and kind of what we can take from having to improve that. We only have a minute here, so let's just quickly go, Maclean, to you. Where did you learn about residential schools and Canada's history there?
I couldn't tell you the grade, but it was high school, and it wasn't given the context necessary. It was just sort of a laid out, this is what happened. But they did make it clear that children were removed from their families with no consent, and I remember the creeping horror of considering that had happened in Canada.
Yeah. Jillian?
I think it was high school as well. I think what stood out to me thinking about that this week is that it was really painted though as history and sort of like, people have been saying like a dark chapter in our history, which it's not. I think that was what was really poignant about Adam's speech, is how these issues are still affecting people's lives directly today. And I think that would be a good tweak to make in our education system.
Mm-hmm, for sure. There's a lot of work to do on our teachings on that. Thank you both for being here this week. Thank you for listening and watching to Political Capital. We'll be back next week with all the latest.